Growing up, I always felt like I was in the shadow of my older brother, Brian. He was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in my mother's eyes, no matter how many times he messed up. I'd watch as she bailed him out of trouble, forgave him for his mistakes, and praised him for even the smallest of achievements. Meanwhile, I felt like I was constantly overlooked, trying to carve out my own space in a house that seemed to revolve around him. I couldn't deny it, I was jealous. But at the same time, I had to accept that this was how things were. It was just the way our family worked. Brian was always the rebellious one. He would skip school, get into fights, and sneak out of the house at night, yet he could always talk his way out of consequences. My mother's love for him seemed to come with an endless supply of second chances, and I couldn't help but wonder if she'd ever give me the same leniency. It was like a game to him, one where he got away with whatever he wanted while I struggled to even get a pat on the back. But I didn't want to complain. After all, he was my brother and I should have been happy for him. But it stung, especially when I realized that no matter how hard I tried, I could never seem to earn the same kind of love and approval. As we grew older, Brian's behavior didn't change. If anything, it got worse. He dropped out of college after only a semester, bounced from job to job, and even started getting involved with some shady people. But my mother, even then, was always there to defend him. He's just trying to find his way, she'd say. Everyone makes mistakes. And I understood that everyone makes mistakes, right? But it felt like Brian's mistakes came with no real consequences, while the rest of us had to deal with the fallout of his actions. Then came Jason. He was my younger brother, the baby of the family. Jason was always a kind soul, shy and reserved, but fiercely loyal to those he loved. And when he met Sarah, it seemed like everything clicked for him. She was sweet, smart, and absolutely adored him. The family loved her too. She was easy to get along with, and you could see how much Jason cared for her in everything he did. They were inseparable, and it wasn't long before Jason popped the question, asking her to be his fiancée. My mother was thrilled. This was the moment we'd all been waiting for. Jason was finally going to have the future he deserved, and Sarah was a perfect match for him. But Brian didn't see it that way. At first, it was subtle. He'd make comments about Sarah, saying how out of his league she was or how unlucky Jason was to have someone like her. We all thought it was harmless, but then things took a turn. One night, after a family gathering, Brian stayed behind to talk to Sarah. At least that's what he told us. The next day, things were different. Sarah had been acting strangely around Jason, like there was a tension in the air. Jason didn't pick up on it at first, but I did. There were moments when Sarah would glance at Brian a little too long, or Brian would make these offhand remarks about her that made me uncomfortable. I brushed it off, thinking I was overthinking things, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then it happened. Jason had to go out of town for work, and that's when I caught them, Brian and Sarah, together. It wasn't just a flirtation anymore, it was an affair. They were sitting in Brian's car in a secluded part of town, holding hands, talking like they had known each other for years. I couldn't believe my eyes. My own brother, the one who could do no wrong in my mother's eyes, was betraying our family in the worst way possible. I was furious, disgusted, and heartbroken all at once. How could he do this to Jason? And how could Sarah, who had always seemed so perfect for him, betray him like this? I didn't know what to do at first. I was torn between telling Jason and confronting them. But after a few days of agonizing over it, I decided I couldn't keep this secret. I had to tell him the truth, no matter how much it would hurt him. So I pulled Jason aside and told him everything I had seen. His face went pale as I explained how I'd witnessed Brian and Sarah together. At first, he couldn't believe it. He thought I was lying or that I had misunderstood the situation. But as I told him more, the pieces started to fall into place. The secret glances, the late-night phone calls, the strange behavior, it was all true. His heart shattered in front of me, and I could see the pain in his eyes. Jason had always been so trusting, and to see him like this, broken by the very people he loved, was unbearable. But what happened next was even worse. Jason turned to my mother for support. He needed someone to help him through this, someone who would take his side. But instead of standing by him, she sided with Brian. She told Jason that he should forgive Brian, that he was just going through a rough patch, and that Sarah was the one who had led him on. My mother, the woman who had always defended Brian no matter what, couldn't even see how wrong he was in this situation. It was like she was blinded by her love for him. She made excuses for Brian, downplayed the betrayal, and practically blamed Jason for the whole thing. It felt like a slap in the face to him, to me, and to everyone who had ever cared about him. I couldn't understand it. How could she stand by him after what he had done? This wasn't just a mistake. This was a deliberate act of betrayal. And yet, my mother couldn't bring herself to hold Brian accountable. She was too caught up in her need to protect him, to keep up the illusion that he was perfect. It didn't matter how much damage he caused to her, he was still the same little boy who could do no wrong. Jason tried to stay strong, but the damage was done. His engagement to Sarah ended, and our family was torn apart. Jason distanced himself from both Brian and my mother, and I couldn't blame him. I tried to be there for him, but I was still reeling from everything that had happened. I had always been caught in the middle of this family dynamic, but now I felt like I had lost everything. My brother's trust, my mother's respect, and the family we once had. The rift between us only grew deeper as time went on. Brian and Sarah eventually started dating openly, and my mother continued to defend him, brushing off the pain and devastation they had caused. I couldn't help but wonder if my mother even saw the damage she was doing to the family. Was she really so blinded by her love for Brian that she couldn't see how much harm he had caused? Or was she just too afraid to admit that he wasn't perfect, that he could hurt people too? It's been years since that happened, and the wounds in our family still haven't healed. Brian and Sarah are still together, and my mother still defends him at every turn. Jason has moved on, but he will never forgive Brian for what he did. As for me, I'm still struggling to understand how everything went so wrong. I've learned to accept that some things can never be fixed, but it's hard to move on from a betrayal that runs this deep. I'll never understand why my mother chose Brian over all of us. I'll never understand how she could defend him after what he did. But I've come to terms with the fact that sometimes family doesn't work the way you want it to. And sometimes, no matter how hard you try, you can't change people, no matter how much you love them.